people call fencing physical chess because you're always trying to think a couple moves ahead from whatever your opponent is doing.
Welcome to Profoundly Pointless. My name is Nick. In this episode, we're going to look at fencing. Our guest is Olympic fencer Jackie Dubrovich. Thank you for joining us. Like and subscribe if you get a chance. So, starting with kind of the basics, like I've seen fencing on TV.
Hmm.
I know what's going on, but I don't really know what's going on.
Yeah, we hear that a lot from a lot of spectators. So yes, at its core, fencing, you're trying to hit the opponent in front of you. And where it starts to get a little bit tricky is there are three different weapons. So I fence foil. There's also epee and saber that have their own rules, their own targets of where you can actually hit and touches register. And then it gets even more complicated because there's something called right of way in fencing. So there's a lot of rules. You have a referee, right, who ultimately designates whose touch it is based on the rules of right of way. It's definitely complicated, but I would say at its core, you're really just trying to hit the person in front of you. And you're trying to get to 15 touches. Whoever gets to 15 touches first, or once time expires, whoever has the most touches, if you don't get to 15, is ultimately the winner. So I hear this a lot from my friends and family that it's very complicated to follow and isn't the most spectator friendly.
It looks cool though, right? Like every time I see it on whenever the Olympics comes around, I'm always like, ooh, fencing.
Yeah, that's usually where most people first see fencing is during every 4 years at the Olympics. I would say probably people who you most commonly associate fencing with, like, you hear one of two things, Zorro or the Parent Trap. That's usually people's first introduction to it. And people love saber fencing. Saber is the really flashy weapon. It's the one where you can they look like they're flying. You can hit people in the head and it counts as a touch. Foil is a little bit different. I would say it's more technical. It has a smaller target area. So we like to say that we just have a little bit more finesse. And then epee, you can hit anywhere in the body. You can hit somebody in the toe, in the finger, and it would still count as a touch.
Which one of those is kind of like that's the big one. That's the big discipline, right? Like I think of track, there's all these kind of things, but I go 100 meters at the end of the day.
Saber is the one that people just love to watch because it's super flashy, it's super fast. You're seeing people get hit in the head, sometimes a bit brutal, I would say, saber. So I think if you're a non-fencer, that's the most appealing to watch.
So then when we look at that, right, like the saber fencers, do they have a little bit of like, ooh, I'm the saber fencer? Are they a little cockier than the other fencers?
I would say there are very distinct personalities that do better in each weapon. I will just leave it at that.
Very that's so basically I'll fill in the blanks for you. Like that's a yes, but you're very diplomatic about it. So how did you know? Like that's fencing doesn't seem like the typical sport that people do. How did you get involved in it?
I first, when I was younger, started doing dance and gymnastics, and I was very tall for my age. I'm 5'10", so grew to be pretty tall. But I was always very uncoordinated, very lanky, and so I didn't fare well in either of those two sports. It was very bad for my self-esteem. I was not good at all. So I had a cousin that fenced, and New Jersey has a pretty big high school fencing scene. It's the most developed in the nation. You have some of the best fencers come out of the New York, New Jersey area. And so I started fencing when I was 8, kind of just playing around with it. Fencing has definitely grown in this country. But back then it was very, very niche. Very few people had heard of it. I had kids make fun of me in school. They're like, do you jump over fences for a sport? So people didn't really know what fencing was. And I initially didn't like it. I really just didn't enjoy it. My parents kind of pushed me to keep fencing. And I started getting good results, first kind of at the local, state level. Then I started traveling to regional competitions, state competitions. Eventually, as I got older, I started representing the US on various teams for international and like world championship teams. And then obviously I've grown to really love and appreciate the sport as I've gotten older. But I would say in the beginning, it was purely motivated by winning and medals and just being, talented at that young age.
Kind of a two-part question, I guess. Like, why are you good at it? When did you realize, like, oh, I'm pretty good at this?
I always had a natural advantage because I was taller than a lot of the younger girls um, my age. So having that length is pretty advantageous in fencing. You'll see that a lot of the top fencers in the world, particularly for my discipline, women's foil, are pretty tall. And yeah, I would say I started noticing probably when I was like in my early teens, maybe like 11, 12, 13. And once you started getting exposure on the national level and kind of seeing the other fencers that you're contending with, and I saw that I could contend with them. I was a very physical fencer, and I still am in my career. I'm very physical, very aggressive. Those are kind of attributes that really benefit me and have gotten me to where I am in the sport.
When we look at like the sport, is it is it better to be faster endurance wise? Like, what's kind of the physical demands that make somebody successful or not successful?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say fencing is super unique in that all different body types can excel in the sport. Yes, being tall and physical has shown in this day and age of women's foil fencing in particular to be, advantageous. But you also think of like fencers who, so the Olympic champion in Tokyo was my teammate Lee Kiefer, and she is completely different body type than me. She's much smaller, skinnier. Um, and it's interesting because fencing, there's advantages and disadvantages to every style, to every body type. And so it kind of levels the playing field. It's really, I would say, how best you develop those skills and attributes based on kind of like your God-given, your body type. So it's really cool because I know obviously in other sports there's certain body types that excel, and in fencing obviously you need to be in shape, but there's no like one overarching body type that you have to be or you have to strive to.
There's not like a thing where you would look at somebody and be like, that person is a fencer. That's the fencer's dream body to have, or something like that.
Not really. You can have a really small but fast fencer fare very well against a taller fencer because they're able to kind of get in between the taller fencer's tempos, and presumably the taller fencer is a bit slower than the smaller fencer. So immediately what comes to my mind is like the Korean fencers or Japanese fencers. They're pretty short compared to us and some of the other countries, but what they lack in height, they're very, very quick. And they can kind of get in between our tempos, and they're really hard to hit. So there's definitely advantages to every single body type.
What would you say is kind of like your overall strategy for when you're like going in?
Yeah, I would say my personal style is very aggressive. I've always been a very aggressive physical fencer. I've definitely tried to develop other aspects of my game as well, and just use my strength and my height to my advantage, but also, just it in fencing, you're always adjusting. That's something that um, I'm sure it happens in other sports, but you see on the international circuit a fencer who kind of has a breakthrough, who does really, really well at a competition. Everybody's immediately watching video on them, immediately seeing what kind of style they have, their tendencies, and they pick up on that and know what to do to counteract that. And I would say from that aspect, fencing is a very cerebral sport, right? You're constantly changing your strategy, your tactics. And so you have to be very flexible in fencing. You have to be able to adapt. And so everybody kind of has, I guess, their core style and things that they're good at, but they're always trying to adapt to their opponents and also to just everybody, watching video on you and knowing what your tendencies are. So in that respect, fencing is really, really difficult, but also really fun because you always have to be creative and constantly changing.
That's what I was going to ask you, right? Like, do you even think necessarily during a match, or is it just all reflexes?
It's a combination of both. I think if you had to choose, it's probably the reflexes that at the end of the day, if it's like 14-14 and you have one touch, whoever wins the next touch, you're probably going to go by your reflexes and all of that training that you've done. versus being able to like have a game plan in that last touch. It really varies. It can be really exciting in that way because I think, you can beat the top fencers, not on any given day, but it happens more frequently than you would think.
Some sports I feel like 10 out of 10 somebody's going to win this one 10 out of 10, and then some of them are like toss-ups all the time. Is it
Hmm.
one of those things where like you can get anybody on any given day?
I would say, and this is speaking specifically for women's foil right now, there are definitely, I would say, like 4 or 5 fencers that have kind of differentiated themselves to be more consistent than other fencers, but they're not immune to losing early. So I wouldn't say on any given day they can lose, but it does happen more often than not. I think, like you said, in other sports, some of those top athletes, like it would be absolutely shocking if they lost in the first round. It happens more frequently than you would think in fencing.
What do you like about it?
Um, I would say how cerebral it is of a sport. I would say that I love the physicality of it, how fast it is. But I also love being able to outthink my opponent. When you have that game plan and you're actually able to execute it, it's so gratifying because so many things can go wrong and it not actually work out in your favor. And so for you to be able to execute what you've been working on in practice or what your game plan was going into a specific bout feels really good. And it's kind of corny, but people call fencing physical chess because you're always trying to think a couple moves ahead from whatever your opponent is doing. And so I really like that cerebral aspect to the sport.
Can you usually go back and look like, okay, this is why I lost to this person?
Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot of video that we watch in fencing. You pick up on things that you did in certain moments of the bout. You can see like specific moments and maybe lapses of focus or judgment, and then like very concrete strategic things. You can see where maybe the bout has shifted, where maybe you were up 8-5 and then you were in your 1 minute break, and then the next period your opponent scored like 10 touches and won. You can see why those things happen, whether it's a strategic shift on your opponent's end, maybe you stop doing something, or just mentally, you lost it. So watching video is a very integral part, I think, of the training process for fencing.
So I may get the resume wrong, but 2020 Olympian?
Hmm.
What was that like?
Yeah, it was my first Olympic. It was a strange one. Tokyo was very, very, a very
Different.
strange, very different. Very different experience, and obviously I'm so like thankful and appreciative of the experience. But it was not like your typical Olympics that you've heard had happened in years past. People were very scared of getting COVID and not competing, so there was less socializing. There was less of that magic at the Olympics where you're meeting athletes from different countries and you're socializing in the lunchroom, right? There was not that much of that. So I'm training for Paris 2024, and I hope to be able to make it to, again, have a shot at another Olympics, but also experience kind of the quintessential part of the Olympic experience.
Yeah, I would imagine that was kind of right. Like if it was me, I wouldn't leave my room, right? Because you'd be disqualified if you got anything, and it would kind of
Yeah.
take away from the experience. I would imagine as you look back on it.
Yeah, there was that whole element of people just avoiding contact with others, and everybody was still wearing masks, and Japan was still one of the strictest places in the world in terms of COVID prevention. And so we were being tested every day, so there was definitely an air of just nervousness, and people were really scared of getting COVID.
Are you ready for some harder slash listener submitted questions?
Sure.
Can you do this professionally? Like outside of the Olympics, can this be something that you can do as a full time living?
In the United States, I would say it's pretty rare. um you you would have to have some pretty lucrative sponsorship to be able to, I think, financially be able to sustain yourself. The money that we make from the United States Olympic Committee, and from like the international fencing body is not a livable salary. So for me personally, I have always had a full-time job. I actually recently quit my job in this past January and just decided to solely train for the first time in my life and just fence up until Paris. But for most people, that's not a reality. The system in the United States is not really set up to be able to fence full time after college. And that's why we kind of see a pretty high attrition rate from when people graduate college because you have to um, 99% of the time have a full-time job, right? With unless you have parents who are still, covering your living expenses and training expenses. So it's definitely difficult. And there's other countries around the world who have different systems, right, with their governments, right, where the government sponsors Olympic athletes or they are part of like their police or their armies. And so that's how they get their salaries that way. But a niche sport like fencing in the US, it is definitely very, very hard to continue fencing post college.
I know this is like a really difficult question to necessarily answer. So as close as you can possibly get. But when you talk about like popularity of it,
Mm-hmm.
where do you think that it would be, right? Like the ones that I can think of immediately off the top of my head, like is it above ping pong, below
Mm-hmm.
ping pong? Like where would you say that it kind of sits in the hierarchy of American popularity?
Probably not high. um, I would say, I've been doing this sport for 20 years now, and it's definitely grown a lot. And I think there's a couple of reasons for that. One is that people have, a lot of parents have understood that fencing can be great for college recruitment. So that's been a big driver of like adoption of fencing in the United States is, the top Ivy League schools, right? Harvard, Princeton, Columbia have like fantastic fencing teams. And so there's definitely a driver there is to get into college. Um, and then you have other great programs like Notre Dame, Stanford, right? All fantastic schools. So that is definitely, I think, a big factor. Um, and I would say also, fencing has gotten more popular through just some people in the sport have gotten into like fashion and things like that and kind of have pushed the sport a little bit more into the mainstream. I still think there's a long way to go. And I think fencing is a really unique sport and it's great to see that it's growing in this country. I definitely think we can grow even more. Um, but from where it was back when I was 8 years old, I think there has definitely been a lot of growth. And I think one thing that does make it sometimes difficult for it to grow in this country is because it often has the reputation it's not spectator friendly because there are a lot of rules, right? And it's kind of sometimes hard to follow, like you said, when you watch it, you kind of have no idea what's going on um, if you're not a fencer. I think there's a lot of things on the back end that USA Fencing can do more in terms of promotional content, marketing, things to kind of draw the masses to learn more about the sport. And I'm curious to see in the lead up to LA 2028 because we do have, really great medal potential both in Paris and in LA as well. How the sport can grow even more.
Why do you think that it isn't more popular?
I would say there is a bit of a barrier to entry. Fencing is an expensive sport. Um, Getting started, you have your equipment fees, you have coaching fees. Fencing has also always kind of had this reputation of being this elite sport, right? You think of kind of the preppy, elite sport. And I think it's trying to kind of shed that image. There's a lot of organizations in this country that are like non-profit organizations that are trying to bring fencing to communities that otherwise wouldn't have had access to fencing. Myself, included, my parents couldn't afford to pay for fencing for me. And so I got by a lot, coaches identified my talent pretty early on. And so they kind of helped invest in me. And I was able to get funding, through the club system in this country, as well as, once you reach the top four in the US, you get funded for your travel. So I think that's one of the biggest factors is kind of that reputation and that barrier to entry. And so making fencing more accessible. introducing it more to communities that may otherwise not have had access to it before is a great way to start growing the sport in the US.
Follow that up with a lighter one. How many times do you think you hop in a bout?
I have no idea. I've never been asked that before. I don't know, but it's a lot. It's a lot because you're constantly moving, right? It's short spurts of really, really intense movement. I don't know. I'd have to get back to you on that one
Yeah,
and
Shaq.
estimate that, but I will say a lot.
Why do fencers move like that? Is that just like the fastest way to kind of move forward and move back or side to side? Like, what's the reason for that style of movement?
Yeah, I don't know, like historically, why that's always been that kind of position, right? If you're right-handed, you have your right leg uh, facing forwards and your back leg in like a 90-degree angle. Um, I'm not sure the historical reasons behind that, but like, I've seen photos of like historical fencing and things like that, and it's always in that position. So it's always been that way. It's definitely a very awkward position, and it's very funny when I have like friends who want to try the sport for the first time. It's very funny to try to see them get into on guard position because it's not a natural position for anybody to get into.
Who's the country? If it's the U.S., it's the U.S. But like, what's the country that like? Oh no, here come the.
For us, it varies by between the men and the women and the different weapons. For us, for women's foil, our biggest competition right now, I would say, are Italy. Italy's number one in the world. We're number two, and also France. So obviously, the Olympics will be in Paris. So fencing, um, France, if we end up fencing them, will be scary because they're the home country. So always have to, you know, they always have an advantage on home soil. Um, and then Italy historically has been the toughest country for us. They have beaten us much more often than we have beaten them. And they beat us in the Tokyo Olympics in the bronze medal match. So we ended up finishing fourth. So
That's got to be hard.
fourth is very painful to walk away with nothing.
Sorry if I just brought up old
No, that's okay. I've had
trauma.
a couple years away from it, so I can talk about it.
Is this a sport where a woman can beat a man?
Yeah, and so I would say in foil fencing, the men, right? They're faster and stronger. There's kind of no way of getting around that. But what's great about fencing, when we were talking about kind of the different body types that can excel, there are always counter actions to every action, and somebody's strength can always be there's always something that you can do to overcome that strength. So I've beaten many men in my training. I would say if I was fencing, let's say at a World Cup, at an international event, in the men's event, it would be very difficult because of just the strength and the speed component. But I do think women are more technical, and I think I can beat a decent amount of men, I would say. And I think I'm also a very physical fencer. I'm very tall. And so that physicality and aggressiveness, I think, benefits me. And so when I do encounter a man who is very strong and fast, I can kind of go head to head with him a bit. But there's also a limit to that as well.
But somebody who goes in one discipline, can they transfer over to another one, or is it like, no, 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 you're good at this one, and you are gonna not transfer over to this one?
Yeah, so at this stage in my career, I would never be fencing FA or saber. They're very different. Now, a lot of people or kids when they start off fencing, they start in foil. In foil, you build a really strong technical foundation, and then from there, sometimes you may move into FA or may move into saber. So I think foil is a great foundational weapon because you just learn the technique really well, and just kind of the basics of fencing. And then you can kind of branch out if you want for the other weapons. Again, FA, like some things that coaches look for when they kind of move their students into different weapons is for FA fencer, they may choose someone who's really, really tall. Being very, very tall in FA, right? FA, you can hit anywhere in the body. The timing is a little bit different. And so being tall is more advantageous in FA. in saber, you kind of sometimes look for somebody who has a lot of like passion and strength and is very emotional. Saber fencing is very emotional, I think. And so there's certain attributes that coaches will look for depending on, and then they'll place them into another weapon if they don't stay in foil.
Does it hurt?
You get used to it, so you get bruises. We have our protective gear, and it does its job for the most part. But if somebody's very strong, they can hit you, and you come away with bruises. Um, Other injuries, like we get a lot of women have a lot of hip problems in fencing because the way that you stand in fencing and the lunging is really hard on our hips, and just women's hips are shaped differently than men's hips. And so you see a lot of the top female fencers have hip problems, like torn labrums, things like that. In terms of like when you get hit, you kind of get used to it. It's not that painful. But for somebody who's not used to it, it will be a little shocking to just get hit with a sword.
I would imagine it feels like a paintball gun. Like,
I've never
that
played
hurt.
paintball, so I can't compare it, but yeah, it leaves a bruise. Like I have bruises after practice, every practice, and I just get used to it.
How would you do in an actual sword fight?
Oh gosh.
How often do you get asked that question? Right? Is that the first question somebody asks you when they find out you're a yeah.
Usually, yeah,
Yeah.
usually something
Okay.
like that. Sword fighting and fencing it's very different. Probably pretty well, like probably better than the average person. um, but fencing is very different. Fencing is not like what you stereotypically imagine, like knight sword fighting, right? It's very different than that. But I would say probably better than the average human.
There's never been like a situation where there was maybe something going on and you've been like, let me use my fencing background to stop this fight or anything like that.
No, no, never. I stay out of those kinds of situations. But I will say fencing definitely like your reaction time, your hand-eye coordination is pretty elite. So I would imagine if I ever got into an altercation like that, I would be
You do
okay.
all right. Who's the best fencer of all time?
She is an Italian women's foil fencer. This is across all disciplines and between women and men. Her name is Valentina Vizzali. She retired. Um, Rio was her last Olympics, I believe. But she has won every imaginable thing, like multiple time Olympic champion, world champion, many World Cup medal titles, team titles. She is the goat of the sport.
What? Why was she so good?
Her timing was incredible. She had incredible timing. Fencing, when she was fencing, was a bit different. I would say now women's foil fencing has definitely become more physical, whereas before the women that were doing very well were not as tall, I would say, and as physical. And so her timing was just impeccable. Like you would watch her and your mouth would be agape at just like how fast she was and decisive, and she knew exactly what to do at every single moment. And she had a crazy work ethic and was a perfectionist, and she was just really, really incredible to watch.
Is there trash talk?
Like in the middle of a fencing bout or afterwards?
Either one.
Not really, because fencing kind of has this. There's a certain decorum that comes with fencing. It's a very respectful sport. You're always, you salute. Before and after a bout, you shake hands with your opponent. There's a lot of respect that happens in the sport. So I would say men's saber has probably the most amount of trash talking. But I wouldn't say there's very much trash talking.
I don't know if this one applies, right? If you want to take this one, take it. If not, if not.
Mhm.
Best sword fight scene in a movie?
Oh, yeah. Honestly, they're all horrible. You know, like I truly think that if you feature fencing in like a movie or a TV show, you need to work with actual fencers to be able to accurately reflect what fencing is like. Everything that you see in like The Parent Trap, or like I hear about the James Bond scene where they fence. Um, Recently, wasn't there the Netflix show with who was it? A Wednesday, the Addams Family. I think there was a fencing scene in it too. It's all so inaccurate. It's very frustrating. It's a little bit of a pain point in the fencing community because all they have to do is hire somebody for a couple of hours to show you how to like properly be in like fencing position and, and just kind of coach you through it. And it would be a lot more accurate than it's currently portrayed.
You may crush my feelings here, but how do you feel about the Princess Bride scene though, right? Like
It's not too bad. It's not the worst one. There's much worse. It's really not that bad. It's one of the better ones that I've seen.
I still think of the I'm not left-handed. I love that one. It's like, but I'm not left-handed. Anyway, best piece of fencing lingo.
Oh, this one's kind of funny. Whenever I say this, I mean, I don't think it's funny, but people who are not fencers think it's funny. So we call the pants that we wear, they're called knickers. And so people think it's really funny. And in England, they call them breeches. So it's just kind of like an outdated term that, people kind of laugh at whenever we say that we have to go put on our knickers or our breeches.
Yeah, it's kind of like
kind of lame.
You gotta mind that. Okay, I don't know if you're one athlete that I asked this question to. He's like, I don't want to answer this. I'm superstitious. But what's kind of coming up next for you? I know you got a lot of stuff coming up. It sounded like.
Yeah, it's very busy for us now. So I leave for Peru this Thursday for zonal championship. And then we have a training camp at Summer Nationals, which is the biggest fencing competition in the country. And we have a training camp in preparation for World Championships, which will be in late July in Milan. And it's a big one because all of this counts towards the Olympic qualification. So the way fencing works is instead of like gymnastics or I believe like diving, there's certain sports where you have just one event, and that's the event that you have to do well at to qualify. Fencing is a full year. So you have to compete at both national and international events, and then you accumulate points based on your results. The top three if you qualify team, the top three will go as individual competitors, and then you have the fourth as a reserve athlete for the team event. So it's very important events coming up, and it's a long qualification season for us.